It's rare to find American-made climbing companies. The shortlist includes the likes of Metolius, Organic, Misty Mountain, UnParallel, and a handful of rope producers. It's even rarer to find technical apparel made in the US, which makes Northwest Alpine so distinct. And by technical, I mean purpose-built clothing designed for the elements, not adventure leisure masquerading as such. Anywho, the idea for NWA was born out of the 2008 financial crisis. Founded by Bill Amos, a quote-unquote climber dude at the time, he wanted to understand what was happening and brushed up on economics. He concluded that basing the economy on financial shenanigans instead of manufacturing wasn't the way to go. So, his solution to one of the worst recessions in the history of the country was to create a pair of pants. At its height, the company employed 75 people and put millions back into the local economy. In this episode, we talk about how Northwest Alpine is developing innovative apparel, the economic and free trade factors that led to mass offshoring, and how many of your favorite brands are making huge profits off the back of exploited labor. NWA harkens back to an older ethos for climbing companies. I particularly enjoyed this chat and hope you do too. Before we get to the interview, a big thank you to Seda, our newest supporter on Patreon. It's thanks to folks like Seda, John, Laura, and many others that we can keep producing episodes, and it's their vote of confidence that lets me do things like hire an editor, which hopefully you've noticed an improvement in audio quality recently. If you like what we're doing, consider becoming a supporter as well at patreon.com/IceIceBeta. We're not here to talk about Graham or Chilo gear. Here to talk about Bill Amos from Northwest Alpine. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You founded the company over a decade ago, but before you were a businessman, you were a climber. I couldn't find much info about what you were climbing, but I know you had some first ascents. So could you just give a bit of background about who you are and what your climbing history is?
I'm from outside of Chicago originally, and this is pretty random. So I started climbing in high school in the kind of the mid 90s. This is really unusual for the time. Obviously climbing gyms are pretty ubiquitous right now, but back then there weren't that many of them. For some reason, someone at our high school, and this is a suburban Chicago high school, had gotten into climbing or something and had brought it back to our high school and had built a climbing wall in our gym.
Oh, cool.
Which was basically just like rocks cemented into the wall. So we had climbing in gym class in the mid 90s in Chicago. Looking back now, it was pretty actually comprehensive introduction. They taught us how to belay and rappel and all the basics really. And before that, I was always kind of into outdoor stuff. I did Boy Scouts, and my dad was big into outdoor stuff, mostly kind of hook and bullet type things.
Mm-hmm.
But we did a lot of backpacking and camping and all that sort of stuff. I also got into skiing in the Midwest, which was something like really climbing was like something that I did, but wasn't my main focus. Skiing was really my focus. And I raced for 4 years in the Midwest. For 2 of those years, I was based out of a hill in suburban Chicago that had 130 vertical feet of elevation gain and like 3 tow ropes. So, you get like 5-second runs, but there's actually quite a few really good skiers that come out of the Midwest because you can't do anything except focus on technique really. So did that. When it came time to look at schools, really my main criteria for going to college was proximity to a ski area. I applied to one school, and that was Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado.
Nice.
I didn't have very good grades in high school. And so definitely Fort Lewis was kind of up my alley, and ended up heading there after graduating and spent 4 years in Durango. And that's really where I got into climbing. So it's probably my second year there that I went ice climbing for the first time. I don't know, 2000 or 2001. Went to Ouray Ice Park because it's only like an hour and a half from Durango, and top roped a bunch of stuff and kind of was like, oh yeah, this is where it's at. So that kind of started my journey. After 4 years in Durango, I ended up moving to New York for a grad school program. Was not happy there, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Going from Durango to New York is kind of a...
well, the Catskills has some skiing. There's the Gunks.
Yeah. So I was in the city and spent most of my time going to Central Park and bouldering at Rat Rock because
oh, cool.
I wanted to be outside. So I didn't stay there very long. It was less than a year. I had a friend that had moved from Durango to Portland. I decided that I needed to get out of New York, and so moved to Portland shortly thereafter, and have been in Oregon since then. I started climbing, I guess, in the Cascades. I'd done trips in college up here to do, Mount Hood and Rainier and that sort of stuff. But really, when I moved here, started climbing in the Cascades a lot, and got around then.
So you're getting into mountaineering then. From what I've seen, I haven't seen like details or anything, but you ended up doing some first ascents. So where did you end up doing more big mountain stuff and alpine climbing?
I would say I did quite a bit of stuff in the North Cascades.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of where I started. So kind of the first big route I did was the north face of Big Four, which is kind of this route called the Spindrift Couloir. It's kind of one of the classic North Cascades snow and ice test pieces. I mean, I don't even know if it's been repeated since we did it in 2006. That was kind of an eye-opening experience for me, because that was the first time that I'd been on something that difficult. I'd climbed a lot of like technical ice and that sort of stuff, but it's kind of interesting because Big Four is on the Mountain Loop Highway. It's kind of a lower elevation area. So the summit of Big Four is only 6,000 feet. So it takes really special conditions for that to come in, because we're in a maritime climate here. So it rarely gets cold enough for that to happen. So when it comes in, it's kind of special. I ended up going and climbing that with a buddy of mine, and we had a little bit of an epic, which has happened. The route's probably been climbed 8 or 9 times, something like that. I think everybody has had something happen. So we ended up getting to the crux pitch, which was like just vertical, rotten ice with no protection. Climbed that, and I was leading, and then got above it and spent about an hour trying to get any kind of decent anchor into this snicey type stuff. Wow. At the end, I was belaying off like a ice tool and then a knife blade that was driven half an inch into a crack, and basically just ended up yelling, "Don't fucking fall." And then we were really late at that point. It was February, so it was getting dark at 5 o'clock or whatever. And we didn't have any bivy gear or anything like that. Ended up spending the night on this tiny, there's like no ledges or anything on it generally, but we found one. But it was one of those situations where one person could kind of sit down and one person stand up. So we did that for 15 hours or whatever it was during the night. I mean, you couldn't really like stay still. So it's like if you were standing, you had to stomp around, and it was just generally miserable night. And that was the first time that I experienced anything like that. The next day we ended up finishing the route. I don't know, we were getting close to the summit around like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and heard some helicopter sounds. I mean, we're like, oh shit. Ended up, my buddy Pete's family ended up calling the sheriff because we were supposed to have been back that night. So they offered to pick us up and everything. It was like, no, we made it this far. We gotta get down ourselves. So ended up doing that. Got down to the base, and then we're driving back, and I think I was driving and started to like hallucinate pretty much because we hadn't really slept for 2 days. So we ended up getting a hotel room, and I hadn't taken my socks off till we got to the hotel room, and took them off, and my toes were black. So that was kind of my first experience with frostbite, which was pretty, I don't know. I still don't have feeling in my toes from that. Like I didn't like lose part of my toes or anything like that. It was just like skin sloughing off and all that. So that was kind of my first like real alpine climb. It just made me more excited to do more of that. And I think like probably from my skills at the time perspective, that was probably the hardest thing I ever did. That year after that was in February. So it took a couple of months for toes to heal and all that. In April, so 2 months later, Pete and I, client partner, ended up going to Alaska together. And we went to Kachatna Spires in the southwest part of the Alaska range, which was another eye-opening experience for me. It's a pretty intimidating place because there's nobody around for 30 miles anywhere. You're flying into this place in this small plane, and looks like you're 20 feet away from the size of these huge mountains. And you're coming in, and I don't even know how the pilots do it, but you can't tell the difference between the glacier and the horizon or whatever. So all of a sudden you're like gliding in and then you're landed on the glacier, throw all your stuff out, and then they fly away and you see this small dot that's receding into the distance. And you're like, oh shit, like now we're here. That was kind of my first expedition experience, I guess. We had kind of crappy snow conditions and we climbed some stuff, but nothing, we didn't really summit anything. And 8 or 9 days into the trip, we were climbing this route called the Going to the Sun Couloir on Sunrise Spire, which is like a 2,500, 3,000 foot couloir that kind of has like rock walls and then like a constriction in the middle where it gets icy. And so we were climbing. We hadn't roped up yet, simul-soloing, and it had been really windy the last couple days before that. Ended up getting to the spot probably like 500 feet up the couloir. Pete was probably like 20 feet above me or something, and we were about to rope up, and I just looked up and saw this wall of snow coming at us, and it's like, oh shit. We ended up getting knocked down 500 feet and pretty much slid out back at our skis.
Oh, wow.
After that, kind of turned our tails and ran and got back to our base camp, and we had a satellite phone, so called, and Paul Roderick came and got us. And yeah, so that was kind of my introduction to Alaska. I was getting avalanche out of this couloir.
Were you guys okay?
Yeah. I have no idea how. So it's basically probably like 50 to 60 degrees in the couloir and just, ragdoll down it. I think I sprained my neck or something like that. Pete had like a leg injury, and so that was a little sore, but that was it. Ended up changing our tickets and getting an earlier flight back to Portland, but otherwise somehow totally unscathed. For some reason, that it made me even more psyched to go alpine climbing.
Man, you are a masochist.
I know.
The more I chat with people in this space, the more the idea of suffering well comes up. It is like a masochism. It's like an enjoyment and seeking out of it, but it's also like knowing how to manage the suffering while you're in it.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Really, that's the name of the game, is just being able to handle being really uncomfortable mentally and physically for extended periods of time, I guess. 2007, I went back. I'd started climbing with my buddy Marcus Donaldson, who's like, anyone that climbs in Oregon knows Marcus. He's kind of a badass alpine ice mixed climber. So that was kind of the beginning of our partnership. Was March of 2007. We went and did the second ascent of a route on Snoqualmie Mountain called Pineapple Express. That was a pretty cool Roger Strong mixed kind of ice, but mostly mixed, classic kind of Northwest, some dirt and turf sticks and that sort of stuff, but super fun. So that was really our first time climbing together. I mean, we'd done a little bit of like ice cragging in Colorado, but after that, decided we were going to go to Alaska together. We had some big plans, but ended up flying into the West Fork of the Ruth Glacier. Actually, I guess we flew into the Mountain House, which is at the beginning of the West Fork of the Ruth Glacier. Our plan was to climb the southwest ridge of 11,300, which is kind of one of those classic ridge climbs. Ended up doing that. We'd planned to be gone for 3 days. I think it was like a 9-mile ski or something to the base from the Mountain House. And then, so do that on the first day, then climb second, third day, then out. But the weather turned super shitty when we were already too far up the route to turn back easily. And so I think we were out for 6 days with 3 days worth of food and maybe 4 days worth of fuel. So that's probably the most suffering I've ever done climbing. Just post-holing through deep snow with no.
But you still have all your toes.
I do, yeah, somehow. I guess both of us frost nipped our fingers pretty good. So when I came back, I didn't have any feeling in my fingers. I could still pick up like hot stuff like quesadillas or whatever out of a pan and not feel it. So, I mean, I guess that's a bonus. But so those were the only 2 trips I ever did to Alaska. I'd planned to go back the next year, back to the Kachatnas with my friend Ryan Johnson. I ended up bailing on that trip for various reasons. And it was almost like every year it's like, oh, I got to go back. And then it never happened. And, now it's 20 years later, whatever, and haven't gone back. Maybe someday. I'd like to go back and go ski on Denali. We'll see if my wife will let me go. Later in 2007, so after Marcus and I got back from Alaska, we started developing kind of a dry tooling, mixed climbing mostly dry tooling crag on Mount Hood because there wasn't really anything like that in Oregon. So it was like the only time you could get on ice tools was to drive to Highlight or wherever, somewhere far away. So we started developing this crag and probably put up, I don't know, 8 or 9 routes so that we could get up there on the weekends and actually get some time on the tools. Kind of the other cool thing that was happening around that time, I don't know, are you familiar with the ice climbing in the Columbia River Gorge?
I am familiar with the Columbia River. I've gone for a hike there.
Nice. Which is an awesome place to hike. But yeah, so the gorge, for anyone that doesn't know, is this amazing area east of Portland, kind of the area between Portland and Hood River. It's a national scenic area, but it's just these massive, probably the tallest peak in that area is Mount Defiance. And it's a 6,000 vertical elevation gain from the river to top of it. So there's a lot of relief in there. But because it's Oregon, there's also a ton of water. There's big waterfalls, but there's also like incipient seeps and seams and that sort of stuff. So like I was saying before, since we're maritime, hardly ever it's cold enough for things to freeze here. But when it does, the gorge turns into like this amazing world-class ice climbing destination for like 2 days. It was always fun. It was like, look at the forecast and, you know, if it looked like it even might be semi-freezing, someone would drive out and look at everything and see if things were coming in or whatever. But we had a super epic year. It's 2009 in the summer. We did a lot of hiking around to look at things. We ended up finding that there was this unclimbed waterfall kind of close to Multnomah Falls, but it looked like it had a mixed dry tooling rock start. Spent a bunch of time going up there and looking at it, and ended up in the summer 2009 bolting the first pitch of this thing. And we were hoping, okay, well, we think that when it comes in, you know, the ice is going to be close enough to the top anchor that we'll be able to climb this in 2 pitches. And somehow it worked out that winter we had like this super awesome freeze, and it was cold for at least a week. Marcus and I ended up going up there, and, you know, we dry tooled the first pitch in the summer. And so went up there and did the real first ascent of the whole thing. Marcus is a pretty rowdy ice climber, so that's probably the most impressive. The second pitch of that, the actual pure ice pitch, was probably one of the most impressive ice leads I've ever seen. Marcus called water ice 5, but it's definitely water ice 6 don't fall sort of deal. So the next day after that, because it was so good, we did the second ascent of a route called Gathering Storm, which was a Jeff Thomas route from the 70s. Jeff was like a Oregon hard man. He did a lot of the first ascents. He was a really strong rock climber in the 70s, probably one of the best in the world at that time. He did a lot of stuff at Smith Rock and all that. They'd done the first ascent in the 70s. It hadn't really come in or no one had climbed it. So Marcus and our friend Jeff and I went up and did the second ascent of that.
So you're really good at suffering and then waiting for opportunities, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have to, you know, if you're climbing in the Cascades, you kind of have to be. It's not, you know, it's not Colorado. Weather here is atrocious. And I think the Cascades has been a good training ground for a lot of guys that have gone out, do big stuff in the greater ranges.
Well, that's what they say about like Scotland or New England even as well.
Oh,
which
yeah.
is like, you go out because otherwise you just don't climb. Like you just deal with it.
Yep.
If you're in Chamonix, like it's shitty weather, you go to the spa or something.
Exactly. So I did one trip to go ice climbing in New Hampshire. That was my only time really climbing on the East Coast. Thing I remember from that, I had like a pair of Gravel tools, and I just remember swinging into some hard ice and my pick like folded in half because it was so fucking cold. I was like, all right. So yeah, I think there's definitely some equivalent suffering to be had. And yeah, I think Scotland also, like I never got to climb there, but it's that same idea. And then Chamonix, I did get to climb in Chamonix right after college. That's such an interesting experience to go there compared to, there's really no wilderness, I feel like, in Europe at this point. Being able to take a tram to 12,000 feet and then go out and not have to carry anything because there's basically a hotel in the middle of this mountain range that you could stay at. It's pretty awesome.
And you can end your day with raclette, which is like,
Oh yeah.
what better than that?
Oh man, so good.
So this is a hard shift. We're going to talk about Northwest Alpine. Why did you end up deciding to start the company?
Around that time when the economy started tanking, I'd taken some economics classes in school, but didn't really have a good understanding of what was happening. So I got kind of obsessed with it for a while, trying to understand, what was really going on. I did a lot of reading on my own. Through that, kind of came to the conclusion that not having manufacturing in our country was going to be a big problem. So it seemed to me like our economy had become one where we just sell houses back and forth to each other and have these financial shenanigans. And that probably wasn't sustainable in the long run. My dad had been an entrepreneur in the food business in Chicago when I was growing up. And I always said, there is no way that I'm ever starting a business, because I saw just, how hard he worked and how difficult it was. He was gone at 5 every morning and back at 6 every night, then traveling somewhere to go meet with vendors or customers all the time, and really didn't want that for myself. But during this time, I started really thinking about it. Through my research into what was happening in the economy, just became interested in business. Maybe it's true that we all become our fathers at some point, but I got really interested in this. Ended up thinking, okay, I want to start a business that supports local manufacturing, because I think that's important. I really wasn't super psyched about the offerings for technical apparel that were available at the time. It seemed like a lot of the companies that had a climbing heritage kind of shifted to lifestyle stuff, which makes sense because that's where most of the market is. So I've decided that I was going to start a company that was going to make things here and was going to make technical climbing apparel. How hard could that be, right? So I ended up talking to people and trying to figure out how to get this started. And around that time, I'd also started to go to work for Chilo Gear, the backpack company based in Portland. So I was kind of getting some exposure to sewing and that sort of stuff. If you bought a Chilo Gear bag in like 2009, 2010, there's a good chance that I probably bar tacked the straps on that thing. Ended up trying to find people that could help me start this clothing company. Went to Craigslist of all places originally because I had no idea where to start, and had some really weird meetings with people until I finally met a young woman that had worked as a designer for some women's athletic brands. She kind of got me on the right track. So she helped me develop our first tech packs for a pair of pants. She had somehow found this tiny, tiny factory in Portland who ended up doing our first production runs. This would have been March of 2010 when I filed the paperwork for the LLC. I'd been thinking about it for a few months before that. And then in September of 2010, we launched with the first pair of pants. I think we made 100 pairs of pants. And I was like, well, so either we're going to sell these or I'm going to have climbing pants for the rest of my life. And that's okay too. So ended up launching the website and did some advertising on cascadeclimbers.com, which was a big forum at the time. Just started kind of going from there. I had some friends like Doug Shepard, who took our stuff to the Alaska range. Him and John Free did big first ascent of, I guess, east face of Dickey or something like that. And he's Doug's wearing this bright green pair of Salopets that we made just for him. And then we had Bruce Miller and Steve Sue and Doug Spo go to Pakistan. They brought our stuff there. So we had these like really good climbers wearing our stuff. And I think that definitely got people's attention.
It says a lot about you and what you were producing that people trusted you for such an important piece of their kit.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to think back. Considering like kind of what we do for wear testing now and all that sort of stuff and what we didn't do back then, it's like, okay, these guys are wear testing our stuff on the first ascent of 7,000 meter peaks or whatever. That's pretty crazy. After that, I got really into trying to figure out the manufacturing side. So, I don't know how familiar people are with what happened to apparel production in the US. Up until probably the mid 90s, something like, I think 70% of apparel sold in the US was still made here. There were two really significant things that happened. And one was the passage of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which was what opened the floodgates, trade between Mexico and the US. So a lot of factories ended up moving down to Mexico, take advantage of labor rates. But the big thing was GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That's what really opened the floodgates for trade to Asia. By 2000, that 70% had gone down to 10%. There was just a mass exodus. It wasn't just apparel, right? Manufacturing, pretty much everything left. What that did was really decimate the textile industry in this country, because manufacturing is not, and this kind of manufacturing especially, isn't part of our economy anymore. People don't quite understand what goes into it. I think people think of sewing and apparel manufacturing as this basic something that should be done in low wage countries because it's labor intensive. So there's not a lot you can do in sewing to automate processes, because fabric is flexible and you really need someone to sit at a machine and sew the garment. Having that kind of exodus of all the factories really destroyed all the knowledge that was there, right? So you had post-industrial revolution, modernization of sewing, all that sort of stuff. There were factories, so there were people that knew how to operate machines. There were people that knew how to fix machines. We made sewing machines here. Union Special was a big manufacturer of sewing machines. There were a ton of fabric mills that knit or wove actual fabric. There were yarn spinners, made the yarn that goes into the knitting mills. Once the sewing left, all that left, because it doesn't make sense to produce fabric here and then ship it overseas to Asia to be cut and sewn. So really it was the destruction of an entire industry. I think what really struck me when I was starting out doing this is that I'm seeing this small part of our economy, which was textiles and cut and sew, but extrapolate that to the larger economy and every other industry. And this happened in every other industry. It's just such a massive loss. Centuries of knowledge just gone. And we're kind of reaping the consequences of that now. It was pretty interesting. After, we kind of outgrew the first factory, the tiny factory that we worked with pretty quickly. And so I ended up meeting a woman that had a big factory in Newberg, Oregon. So southwest Portland, about 25 miles in wine country. And she'd had this factory in the 80s and 90s, and they were decent sized, probably had like 50 operators, something like that. But she had shut that down in 2000 when all the offshoring was happening. And she had a lot of like trims left over from the companies that she worked for. So, and like little labels and zippers and that sort of stuff. And she had just like shoved all that into a shipping container and put it on her friend's property, and it just sat there for 10 years. So I went over there with her to help her clean it out, and it was crazy because she had these labels and trims and whatever from companies like Patagonia and Columbia and Serac and all these brands that used to make stuff here, and now none of them do.
From what I understand, like the promises of GATT was that more world trade would facilitate more like job creation in developing countries, and what that would allow is like goods to be produced cheaper. So like with more trade, more exchange of ideas, more exchange of like democracy is really part of the argument too. But it was bringing more people into like the world economy. And one of the arguments was that for the US, it would be sort of like you could upgrade the jobs here. More people would be able to get higher quality jobs, is sort of like the catchphrase that people were using. But that would mean like less manufacturing and like hands-on jobs, and maybe more like managerial and research jobs.
Really, the theory, and it was a theory, was that the US would transition to more of a service economy and that we would let other countries do the hard work. That interview is really interesting because you can almost see how it became this like foregone conclusion that was the natural and right thing to do. This globalization was inevitable. And Goldsmith in that interview is sitting there saying, well, hold on a sec. Like, this is what's going to happen when you do this. In that interview, Clinton's trade advisor or economic advisor, whatever she was, is making this argument that companies aren't going to move all their manufacturing overseas. They're going to use manufacturing in these countries to supplement their domestic manufacturing. Clearly that didn't happen. What it really was a money grab by big corporations, kind of cheerled by Wall Street. They were looking at, okay, if you can reduce your cost of goods sold by 20% or whatever it is, then, your profits are going to skyrocket and your share price is going to benefit from that. And we're going to benefit from that. So that was really the actual driver of it, not anything to do with, well, what's going to actually be good for our economy and the citizens of the US. Basically, you had massive gains in productivity and very little gain in actual wages for the vast majority of people. So it benefited some people and very few people in an insanely positive way. And a small number of people made a shitload of money and everybody else kind of got fucked. This idea that in the 90s, around this time, that, well, we're coming into a new economy. It's going to be a service economy. It's going to be better. Like, we're not going to have to work as hard. These manufacturing jobs aren't going to be around. There's a place in Kentucky called Campbellsville, Kentucky. Campbellsville was a big manufacturer for Hanes, or maybe it was Fruit of the Loom. I think it was Fruit of the Loom, not Hanes. That was their employer, basically. They had a plant that had like 5,000 people working for them. Fruit of the Loom ended up moving all their production to Honduras originally before they went to Asia. There was a New York Times, I think it was New York Times article about it in the year 2000, something like that, where they're talking about Amazon maybe had like 4 warehouses, around the whole country at that time. And a new one was going to be built in Campbellsville. And they're talking about how this is going to replace, all the Fruit of the Loom jobs, and these are going to be great jobs. But then you look at like what actually happened there. Are people better off in the year 2024 than they were in the year 2000? No. I've been to Campbellsville. I actually went there a couple of years ago. After Fruit of the Loom closed, there was a kind of offshoot of Fruit of the Loom employees that started another factory called Campbellsville Apparel. And Campbellsville Apparel became the largest manufacturer of underwear for the DoD. So they were a big military contractor. They ended up closing down. They had their last production shift on a Wednesday, and I was there on Friday talking to them, which was really interesting experience. If you look at these towns and these places that were affected by globalization, they're still struggling. That's a good chunk of rural America. I think a lot of people are surprised by the rise of Donald Trump in 2015. And I think people that live in urban areas maybe didn't understand the extent that people in rural America kind of got screwed.
So you were growing as a business, and you had to develop more capacity for manufacturing. Do you want to talk about maybe how you got to Kachatna?
From, about 2011 to 2013, most of our production was being done in Newburgh. So Cheryl, who had the factory I talked about in the 90s in Newburgh, she had kind of scaled down her manufacturing, and she was basically had like cutting table in her house. And so she was cutting fabric there and then farming it out to home sewers. There's people that sew in their garages, and that's how a lot of our stuff was being made in that time. It worked for a little while, but becomes difficult from a quality control perspective, and also like just a general capacity and trying to grow volumes and all that perspective. So 2013 kind of decided that we were going to have to do something, and couldn't really find any other factories to work with. There were a few around Portland, but no one that could really do what we wanted to. So I decided that would be a good idea in that time to start our own factory. How hard could that be, right? Ended up coming up with a deal with Cheryl, and we bought a lot of her old equipment. And this whole time I was meeting other apparel companies, small people like us, that were also looking for sewing and couldn't find it. I had this idea that, because we've never had, in this time, we never had money really. So the idea was that, okay, we can do this contract sewing and use that as a way to support Northwest Alpine production, because there is all this business out there. I think that we can do this. So in 2014, we started with 2 people. It's kind of interesting. It's like kind of juxtaposing this to people taking our stuff into the mountains, somehow people trusted us to make their their clothes in the beginning, even though, we really didn't know what we were doing. But we ended up getting some work there. We did things like kind of the first apparel for Cotopaxi and worked for some local brands, and definitely struggled in the beginning for probably the first 6 or 7 months trying to figure out what's going on. And then I ended up meeting a guy from Honduras who ironically had gotten his start at Fruit of the Loom in Honduras. He ended up coming on as like in a plant manager position. From there, we just kind of exploded. So our manufacturing side, our contract manufacturing side really started to grow fast. And that was what was keeping the lights on and keeping everybody paid. So Northwest Alpine kind of started to take a back seat to that. And then probably in 2015, we ended up working with a woman based in Houston. She has a brand called Fleo. They're a women's athletic brand. And we kind of started with her at the beginning. She does a lot of like booty shorts and leggings and that sort of stuff. I didn't really expect much from it. I thought it was just going to be like a regular contract or whatever. But somehow, I mean, she got in on like Instagram when you could like grow a organic audience. She ended up just blowing up. So we ended up being able to scale her production with her growth to the point where at the height we were making something like 10,000 pairs of shorts a month for her. It was crazy. It was fun. It was really fun though, because it was like, we were making a lot of money. It was exciting. There was a lot of growth, all that sort of stuff. So that was like 2015, maybe late 2015, 16, 17, 18. Northwest Alpine is still around. It's been around this whole time. It's just small. Like we would do random production runs and ended up getting some other contracts. And then in 2018, we'd expanded into another building in Newburgh, and we moved all of our cutting over there, and being in two buildings kind of sucks. So ended up deciding that we needed more space. Most of our employees at that time, I think we probably had like 25 or 30 employees. Most of them were coming from Salem. So commuting from Salem to Newburgh. So decided to start looking at real estate and ended up buying a building in Salem in 2018. We were probably in maybe 5,000 square feet in Newburgh between the two buildings, and then bought this 20,000 square foot building. So it was quite a jump in space, and that really gave us more room to grow. And of course, there's challenges during this time. And then 2019 came around, then 2020 came around, I guess in March of 2020. So right before COVID started, our plant manager ended up quitting like a week before everything shut down. He'd been a pretty key guy in that. So he quit. Then a week later, COVID shutdown started, and all of our business was canceled pretty much because people freaked out. So, we had few $100,000 worth of purchase orders that were all of a sudden not there for, revenue that we needed over the next few months. And that was really though when the implications of offshoring really came into full focus, I think, for me, because we were right there. It was almost immediate that we started getting calls about making masks and gowns based on like the complexity of what we were doing in athletic and outdoor stuff. Making this other masks and gowns was easy for us. So we immediately transitioned to doing that. I think in April 2020 was actually our best month ever from a net income perspective, because we made thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of masks. Did a bunch of gowns for Samaritan Hospital here in Oregon, and then worked for other folks, and then ended up getting a big contract with the hospital system in Arizona. And this was kind of our downfall in the end for Kachatna Apparel. We had a tenant in one side of our building, so we booted them. All of a sudden, we've doubled our overhead for our space. We bought a bunch of equipment, hired a lot of people. I think at our max, we had about 75 people sewing, and it looked like that was going to keep going. Like there was a lot of talk in that time about supply chain, and there was a lot of like celebration, I feel like, of because almost everybody that was doing what we were doing got into doing PPE because we were the ones that knew how to do it. It felt like there was a really positive movement and that this was going to last, because why wouldn't it? There were doctors wearing freaking garbage bags for a while there because China shut off all their exports of PPE. That was the wake up call. And it was plain as day. Like China's willing to shut off exports if it benefits them. And they did. And we were really screwed. My feeling in that time was naively that we're not going to let this happen again. We can't be in that position again where we're that vulnerable. I was proven wrong, over the next probably 6 months after that, when China really started ramping their production back up and they flooded the market with cheap stuff, and everyone making stuff here got killed pretty much. That was eye-opening for me and disappointing for me. We should know this, that all we care about in this country for the most part are short-term financials, and there's no long-term plan.
So speaking of quality and sort of longer term thinking and making products that last, I know that those are some values of Northwest Alpine, which we've actually talked very little about the products that you've made and the purposes and sort of like what it stands for. So do you want to just give us like an overview of the products that you produce and sort of like the technology and the fabrics? Because I know you like to geek out on that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Part of our core ideals in the beginning has always been, why to make technical apparel that's functional for what we do, climbing and that sort of stuff. If you look at like a lot of what's available from brands and you look at what companies are doing, there's really hasn't been a lot of innovation, and a lot of people offer the same products. A lot of the big brands use the same manufacturer. So there's a lot of similar stuff out there. I get really excited about weird fibers and new yarns and that sort of stuff. So one thing we did, I got interested in this stuff called ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, also known as Dyneema or Spectra. Those are trade names. I got into that stuff actually when I was working at Chilo Gear, because Graham was kind of the first one to pioneer making bags out of Dyneema. That was my introduction. So I got hooked up with those guys, Cubic Tech, they were called before they got bought by Dyneema. Wes Hatcher is their product developer. He's a good friend of mine. So we worked on a bunch of stuff together, and we ended up making a jacket called the Eyebright jacket. That was the first commercialized waterproof breathable Dyneema jacket. It's pretty awesome. Weighed like 4.8 ounces or something ridiculous like that. That was probably 2013 or 14, around then. Since then, we've been playing with different things like, okay, what can we do with this fiber? So in 2016, we ended up hooking up with Honeywell. They're the manufacturer of Spectra. Ended up working with them on developing some knit fabrics using blends of Spectra and other fibers. We called that our Fortis line. We initially had some polyester Spectra blend stuff that was pretty cool. We were making it for a while, and this is during the era where most of our focus was on manufacturing and not on the brand. So probably around 2021, that Spectra product really started taking off. We sold out of everything that we had, and then ended up getting completely ghosted by the vendor for that fabric. So all of a sudden we had all this demand for this product, but couldn't get it anymore. At the same time, Honeywell is a giant corporation. Some higher up there ended up looking at this program and being like, why the hell are we doing this? And they ended up cutting all their support for the program. So I had to go back to square one and redevelop this whole supply chain. So that's kind of what I've spent the last few years doing, is getting that done. And we're finally at a point where we have it solved. So I've pretty much built a North American supply chain for our new Fortis fabrics. I'm pretty proud of it because most kind of technical materials are coming out of Asia because they're the ones that have all the equipment. We kind of figured out how to do it here. So we have Fortis fabric that's made in Los Angeles now, which is pretty sweet. So that's kind of the thing that I'm most excited about, is that we're going to be relaunching these products here over the next, April is really when they're going to come out. So these are our new base layer fabrics. So what the UHMWPE does, so we're not using like Spectra or Dyneema, but it's the exact same fiber. It's just non-branded. UHMWP in itself is 10 times stronger than steel on a like strength weight basis. So super light, super strong. So what we do in the knits is UHMWP is extruded into filament, basically. What we do is take that and then it gets chopped up into staple fibers. So fibers that are probably 8 inches long, something like that. And then those are all spun together. Then those will be spun into yarn with nylon or polyester. And then that yarn is knit into the fabric. So basically what that's doing is the PE fibers are reinforcing the other polymer fibers and just making them stronger. What we're trying to do is just build a layer that lasts a really long time. People talk about sustainability and that sort of stuff and recycled materials. And a lot of that's largely just marketing bullshit from a energy consumption perspective and all that. Recycled materials aren't any better than, using virgin polyester. There's always going to be waste in manufacturing. You can't make something and not have some consequence. But what we want to do is make less stuff and make it last longer. That's the goal. But we actually want to do it, unlike other companies that say they want to do it, but will turn around and make $1 billion worth of product every year. So Fortis is, one of the exciting things. Another really exciting one. Do you know much about what's going on with PFAS and the regulations around that?
Yeah, I know that California enacted industry-leading regulation that says that it has to be eliminated.
California and Washington are really leading the charge there. PFAS are like the forever chemicals. A Gore-Tex membrane is Teflon, basically. It turns out that that's a forever chemical that's really bad for the environment, and it's in all of us. That's kind of like the wild thing. If you take like a blood sample from anybody on the planet, it contains PFAS. What we're about to see is like a wholesale change in waterproof garments. I was talking to a friend of mine he's a rep for OR, and we were just talking about this a little bit and what it's going to be like, because the performance of waterproof breathable garments is about to shit the bed, basically. I think that consumers have an expectation of how these products work, and unless there's like some serious education on the part of the retailers and part of the brands, which doesn't seem to be happening, there's going to be kind of a revolt, I think, because basically Gore-Tex is, what do they call it? Their EPE offering, which is their like PFAS-free membrane, sucks. It doesn't work. Not that their normal product really works very well, but this works even worse. And they're getting rid of like ProShell, and they're getting rid of all what they offer now because they have to. It's going to be real interesting because I think people are not going to be psyched. Probably want to keep your waterproof breathable stuff if you want something that works, or you can buy our new stuff. So we're working with this awesome little company based in Taiwan. They're from the US, but they live in Taiwan. They have commercialized. So I've known about this membrane for probably 12 years. Originally introduced to it because Dyneema had been trying to build some waterproof breathable fabrics using this. It's made from polypropylene. It's like a electrospun polypropylene membrane. No one could figure out how to actually laminate it. So it's been super breathable, really good numbers in the labs. I've tested jackets with it and been really impressed. But again, like no one could figure out how to actually make it work until these guys figured it out. Basically, it's like this two younger American husband and wife, and then this like old Taiwanese dude that's been like laminating things forever, and he somehow figured out how to do it. Now they've been making these PFAS-free fabrics for the last few years, and we've been working with them for a while. We had a jacket that was out that had it. We don't right now, but we're going to be relaunching here probably sometime this summer with them. But totally PFAS-free, waterproof breathable jacket, and it looks like the entire thing is going to be recyclable, which is pretty rad. So we're working on getting recycling facilities in Europe that are able to basically take your used rainwear and recycle the whole thing back into feedstock for more polyester. So that's super exciting.
Are you looking for beta testers?
Potentially. We should have some more samples here shortly. So we got Fortis, we got the new, they're called Trenchant Textiles. So our new Trenchant Textiles jacket. We have a new belay jacket that we've been working on for a couple years, but it's super rad. We had a belay jacket in our line for a while that people seem to really like. And problem was we used a pretty light nylon ripstop on the shell that wasn't super weatherproof. So we ended up on this jacket working with Toyota, Japanese company. Basically, the shell it's a ripstop. So in the ripstop grid, that yarn is liquid crystal polyester, which has some similar characteristics of Dyneema and stuff. So super strong, super abrasion resistant. In the 90s when the Mars Pathfinder mission had airbags that deployed when it was landing on Mars. Those were made out of liquid crystal polyester. And we've got some waterproof PU coating on the inside that's breathable. So yeah, I'm super psyched about that as well.
That is really cool. That's awesome. It's really interesting to hear all that you're doing now and how psyched you are, because you've been working on this company for over a decade. It's one thing to look at a situation and just get really curious about it and to read about it. It's another thing entirely to just be like, oh, I need to like do it and build this thing and then stick with it.
When I was growing up, my mom always told me that I had like a one-track mind. I see that in myself, and that one track was focused on climbing for a long time. Around that time, 2009, 2010, I just kind of became obsessed with manufacturing and with apparel and all that. I feel like when I lock onto something, there's nothing I can do.
Fair enough. During that recession, it was actually the second biggest job loss after World War II. It was like 8 million people lost their jobs. For you, as you were scaling your manufacturing business, you ended up actually employing at least 75 people, which is quite a bit, because like most American-made manufacturers that are sort of like in the outdoor space are kind of like garage-sized or like 1 or 2 person shops. What did it mean to you to be able to provide so many jobs?
It's awesome. And I felt like a awesome responsibility to the people that I employed. It's scary. It's a lot of responsibility when you have a business that size. Like, those people are relying on you for their livelihood and for their family's livelihood. It could definitely be overwhelming at times. I mean, when things are going well, like, it's awesome and things are great and everybody's making a lot of money. But when things are tough, they're tough. And I have a $70,000 payroll and I only have $50,000 in my account. That, can get a little stressful at times. But to me, like, looking back now, kind of when we were at our height, we were paying millions of dollars of wages into the local economy, and thinking about what that does to the communities that those wages are being paid into is a huge multiplier, right? When you aren't making stuff here, most of that money is going overseas. I'm proud of what we did, definitely, and felt positive. And it was heartbreaking for me to have to shut that down and have to lay off people that had been with us for almost 10 years. But I guess it still really made me believe that this is the right thing to do. No matter what bullshit academic economists, and people that have never worked in a business before in their entire lives, no matter what they say about comparative advantage or how it's better for us to manufacture shit overseas, that's bullshit, because I've seen it. I've seen the impact that it has in the local community. I don't care about the broader like theories behind free trade and all that. I know that we made a difference. I think that's awesome. And I think that there's a lot of other people that see that and are doing the good work.
You had a post on Instagram. You were breaking down like the retail price of a jacket and then evaluating like what the costs in particular of labor that go into it. It was interesting because you were getting some blowback. What do you think that like pushback was coming from?
In that post, it was controversial because I said, do you know how much the person that sewed your jacket got paid to sew it? Your $250 jacket. The reactions were definitely mixed, right? So there were a lot of people that were like, fuck yeah, like, whatever. But there were a lot of people that were like, well, that's bullshit because cost of living and yada, yada, yada. There's one brand in particular that people are very fond of that claims to have certain values that maybe aren't real. When you criticize that brand, especially, it becomes, very, very controversial, I think. I have a little different perspective because I've owned a factory. I know how long it takes to sew something when you're efficient. So I understand how to cost things. I know how much things cost. There's one factory group in particular, which is massive. They're called Young One. They make stuff for all these outdoor brands. Young One has big factory in Bangladesh and in Vietnam. I think what prompted that post is that Bangladesh garment workers were striking. They're protesting because their monthly minimum wage is $75. That's definitely not a living wage in Bangladesh. When you start looking at what does $75 look like on the sewing floor, basically, it comes out to something like a penny and a half a minute. You start to look at some of these garments. So something like a wind jacket, I know because we sew them, that takes 45 minutes to sew. If they're paying a penny and a half a minute, then that worker is getting paid, was it 70 cents to sew a jacket that is then being sold for $160 or whatever it is. Then you start looking at the financials of some of these companies. So a lot of the big outdoor brands are publicly traded companies, so their financials are available. Young One is a publicly traded company in Korea, so you can find their financials. And then you look at some of the rhetoric that the brands talk about. Kind of one of the interesting comments on that post was we actually had a product developer from Patagonia comment on the post. He was pretty pissed off about the whole thing and ended up saying, well, why are you criticizing us when we're trying to fix the system? You stick with the broken factory and you work to fix it. And it's like, okay, how long have you been working with Young One? Let's look at Young One's financials. In 2022, they made something like $510 million in net profits off $3 billion in revenue. That's insane. So you, being Patagonia, you're one of the biggest outdoor brands in the world, don't have any real say. They're one of your main manufacturers, and they're making $510 million in net profits a year, and they're paying their people $75 a month. Come on. And you're telling me that you're sticking with them and fixing it, but this is year after year after year after year. Not only does Young One have $500 million in net profits every year, we can look at Patagonia. I'd estimate that they probably have $200 million in net profits every year. There's $700 million in net profits, and you are basically exploiting the lowest paid, most vulnerable workers in the entire world. At the same time, you're proclaiming virtue and all that sort of stuff. People don't really want to hear that. They want to believe that when they're buying something, the companies that they're buying from are doing good and they can feel good about buying it and not have to think about it, really. I think people should question that and question the marketing and understand that these are not your outdoor brands of the 70s. They're massive corporations with huge profits and maybe actual actions that don't match their values that they claim.
Maybe we can end on an uplifting, positive note. What's next for you in Northwest Alpine?
I mean, I'm super psyched. We've been doing this since 2010. It's been a lot of ups and downs, especially over the last year and a half since we shut down our factory. Now I'm just super excited to be solely focused on Northwest Alpine and growing the brand. And it's been awesome. Like, we've been getting great feedback from customers, and really just me being able to go back and reconnect with the brand and reconnect with people and see how psyched people are. And, I love going out. I love seeing people wearing our stuff. It's so weird for me still, like, but it's awesome. So, there's a lot of thirst for made in the US stuff among certain people. And I think people see the value in that and want to support it. I'm hoping that we can keep that trend growing. And I think that we're doing something that's really different. I'm just some climbing dude. Like, I'm not some big, rich CEO guy or whatever. I feel like I want to get back to what the outdoor industry was back in the day, when it was people like you and me that were just climbers and want to go do fun stuff and want the right gear to do that. I think there's a bright future in that. And I hope that people that are listening will check us out and get psyched.
Where can people check out your products?
Yeah, check out nwalpine.com. You can follow us on Instagram. We're just at NW Alpine Gear. There's also like a retailer list on our website. So maybe there's a shop close to you that has our stuff.
Do you have any climbing trips planned for the year now that you have a little bit more time on your schedule?
The only trip I have planned right now, actually, I just booked tickets. I'm going to Iceland in March. One of my good friends lives there, and we're going to go backcountry skiing for a week. So that's going to be my first time internationally traveling to go climbing in a long time. So, or to go skiing, whatever, to go do fun stuff. So, yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoy that. And Bill, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was real fun.
Bill is graciously giving away 2 Black Spider hoodies for listeners, one men's and one women's. To enter, head to our Instagram at ice_ice_beta to find the details. If you'd like to follow along with what Northwest Alpine is up to, their Instagram is at NW Alpine Gear. To check out their products, head to nwalpine.com. They have several new lines dropping this year, which you heard about in the interview.